Hi, thanks for tuning in to Ancient Greece, Declassified. Episode 15, Homer's Meta Odyssey. The Odyssey. The original Odyssey, the OG of all adventure sagas, which continues to inspire art, books, and movies to this day. It's such a classic, it's become an everyday word. It's also the source of other words we use, like Cyclops, Siren, and Mentor. Its central theme of nostos, or homecoming in Greek, has given rise to the term nostalgia, the yearning to get back to where you once belonged. Get back, Odysseus. Your family's waiting for you. The underlying question of today's episode is, what's the big deal with the Odyssey? Why has it been considered such a classic? With us today to help us appreciate the storyteller's art is a world expert on epic poetry and Greek mythology. Richard Martin is professor of classics at Stanford University. His book, Myths of the Ancient Greeks, is widely considered the authoritative English rendition of the Greek myths. He also has a new book out called Classical Mythology, The Basics, which explains how myths have been interpreted throughout history, as well as the role of myth in modern art, culture, and politics. Richard Martin, welcome to Ancient Greece Declassified.
Great to be here.
Classicists are often asked what got them into such an arcane field. So I'm curious, was there a book that you read early on that got you into the classics, and was it Homer, perhaps?
Well, it's hard to think back so long, but I think it was a series of books, and it wasn't quite Homer. Back when I was in grammar school, they had acquired somehow in the little school library a complete set of folk tales of the world illustrated, and I worked my way through them. So the real question is why I was interested in folk tales, and my tentative answer for that is because I grew up in Boston with an extended family, grandparents and grandaunt and uncle and parents all in the same house. And they would be constantly telling stories of the old country. So I think I moved from, hearing stories when I was a 4-year-old to reading folk tales when I was a 9-year-old. And certainly one of these volumes was illustrated myths of ancient Greece. And so from there, by the time I got to the 8th grade in grammar school, I was ready, and then they asked us to read the Odyssey in probably one of the worst prose translations by George Herbert Palmer. But I see in retrospect it was the cheapest paperback that they could ask us to buy. And despite the rebarbative prose, or maybe because of it, I was intrigued. And so, yes, I did read the Odyssey as a, what would that be, like a 13-year-old. Concurrently, I was into Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, and they seemed to reinforce one another, these two long epics. And then when I went to high school, we had to study Latin, and Greek was held out as a kind of treat beginning in sophomore year. And at that point, we could see that the seniors in our high school classics group were doing Homer. And I remember picking up, it must have been W.B. Stanford's edition that one of them had left lying around and trying to hack my way through, after having a couple of weeks of Xenophon and finding that it was difficult and therefore it was attractive. So that's the kind of short story. It always seemed to be interesting and fun and not like working. And somehow it turned into my career.
That's so interesting. Now, it's always nice to hear Homeric scholars who spent years on these texts to show us how it sounded. So would you mind reading the beginning of the poem to give us a taste of how it would have sounded to hear Homer back in the day?
Well, of course, this is how we think it would have sounded, and there's lots of dispute about that. So I will do my best, probably not respecting pitch accent as much as I should. Andra moi ennepe musa polutropon, hos malapola plankthe, epe troies, hierom toliathron eperse. Polon danthropon iden asta karna on egno, pola dogin ponto pathenalgea hon katathumon, arnumenos hente psukein kai noston hetairon.
Beautiful. And the English of that is?
Tell me, O Muse, of the man of many devices, who wandered full many ways after he had sacked the sacred citadel of Troy. Many were the men whose cities he saw, and whose mind he learned, aye, and many the woes he suffered in his heart upon the sea, seeking to win his own life and the return of his comrades. Yet even so he saved not his comrades, though he desired it sore, for through their own blind folly they perished. Very Victorian sort of King James Bible version.
Yeah. One thing that's interesting about this intro is that we've talked in other episodes about how the first page or the opening of a work says a lot about what this work is going to be about. And most people, when they think of the Odyssey, they think of the monsters that Odysseus encounters, like the Cyclops and Circe and Scylla and Charybdis, all these adventures on the sea. None of that is mentioned in this first page. Is that puzzling, or what do you make of that?
I think it is puzzling, and I think it's probably intentional, so that focuses you on what is mentioned. We learn that it's a man who sacked Troy. He wanders around. He loses his companions because of their own idiocy, atastoliason, because of what they did. We don't even know the name of the hero. We don't learn that for about another 30 lines or so. And I think the focus here, and here I'm in line with some scholars who worked on the proem, makes us think of the end of the poem, when the suitors will lose their lives through their idiocy, and a person will take away their homecoming, and that's Odysseus.
So the companions of Odysseus here, due to their own folly, are lost at sea and they lose their homecoming. And then at the end of the work, there's a kind of symmetry where the suitors of Penelope, the people that are trying to marry Odysseus' wife while he's away and take his place, they also then suffer a loss of homecoming in a sense.
Exactly. And, if you just heard about this, 108 suitors, unarmed, killed, you might think, well, wait a minute, where's the ethics? Why is that moral? So in effect, the poem sets you up for the equivalence and makes it a moral duty for the homecoming Odysseus because of the stupidity of the suitors. That's the key, that they brought it on themselves. So Michael Nagler at Berkeley has beautifully argued that the proem is out to resolve an ethical problem that the poem might otherwise raise.
That's fascinating. Now, if we go a few pages down, we hear that the god Poseidon is far off in the land of the Ethiopians, which is sub-Saharan Africa. And elsewhere in the epic, we hear about the Hyperboreans, the really far northerners, and we also hear about the Atlas Mountains in what is now Morocco. So the geographical expanse that this epic takes part in is truly vast. I mean, isn't this, how could, as the Greeks are emerging from the Dark Ages, how could they have such a vast conception of the world at that time?
Well, of course, this pushes us to the next question: when was the poem composed? And my own view is that it was a long process. And so all along the way, I think generations of poets are incorporating bits of interesting information about the expanse of the world, including all of the ones you mentioned. We know that by the 7th century, colonization had really taken off. Greek colonization in the Black Sea, in the Western Mediterranean, and Greeks were back in Egypt, traders. So I suspect there were lots of tales, the kind that you hear in Herodotus in the 5th century, already circulating and being incorporated into the poetry.
Great. Now, in the previous episode we did on Homer, we talked about the hundreds of years of oral tradition that produced the tales that make up the epic. But there's also a sense among some scholars that there might be one man's creative stamp in stitching together the tales into the Odyssey and the Iliad. So do you think that there is a considerable influence on both epics by a single individual at the time that you said it, around the 7th century or so?
I think there are several important individuals at play in this expanded tradition, any one of whom we might call Homer. And when people who do oral poetics, like the late John Miles Foley, encounter these things, they realize that the great figure they think is the one shaping the composition is basing usually his composition on something he claims he got from another great figure who's now, of course, out of reach. So I can see a series of maybe 3 or 4 Homers. Which one do you want to say really shaped the Odyssey? Is it the last one? Well, who thought of putting it in this order? Maybe that was the second one. And who thought of just focusing this way on the son of Odysseus? Maybe that was the first one. So yes, there's individual shaping, but there's also a tradition. And I think that's the difference in oral poetics. It's not like reading Conrad or Henry James. We can't pin it down to one master performer.
Interesting. So as you mentioned, we don't hear the name of the main hero of the epic till later. And the first few books, the story takes us to the home of Odysseus, where Odysseus is not there. And we see his home. We see his son and his wife and all the suitors who are hoping to marry her. Why do you think we start the story in this way? Why do we get, 4 or 5 books of the domestic aspect with the hero missing before we actually find the hero?
I think this is part of the brilliance of the composition. The hero is absent for his immediate family, for Penelope and Telemachus and Laertes. The hero is also absent by definition for the actual audience. And so, if you like, the family of Odysseus plays the role of the audience or makes a kind of connection with the actual audience. And we're all waiting for the appearance of the hero. So it heightens the suspense, but it also focalizes the action through people who are more like us, if you like.
That's so interesting. Now, in one of the scenes in the first book, there is a bard who is singing the song of the return home from Troy of the Greek heroes. And, readers wonder, this is so soon after the Trojan War, in this world, how is it that the bards are already singing tales of what just literally happened a few years ago?
Yeah, we might wonder, and we always think that they're more primitive and things just took a lot longer, and it's true, probably they did. But if you think of the beginning of Aeschylus's Agamemnon, where there's a beacon message system so that Clytemnestra knows about the fall of Troy within a few days of the fall of Troy, I think probably it's not unrealistic that already stories are circulating out of Troy to the far western reaches of Ithaca within, I would give it 6 months. What strikes us is that Greeks travel a lot, even in the Archaic period. And again, I think of colonization. So that's not impossible. Of course, that story is not going to include Odysseus because nobody knows about him. And that's why Penelope wants the bard to stop singing the story of the return of the heroes. It's very painful because Odysseus is not in that story. He doesn't have a story yet.
And that's the story that Homer or whoever is telling us.
Precisely, yeah. It's like Homer advertising, okay, I'm going to fill the gap there. All of the other sequels have been told, but not the big one. So it's yet another one of these brilliant touches.
And when Penelope asks the bard to stop singing of this topic, which is so painful to her because Odysseus is not back yet, Telemachus, trying to assert his, manhood among these very scary suitors, he kind of defends the bard and says, people always want to hear the latest songs. So we think of these epics as these old fossilized things, but there's a sense in this world that people like new stuff, and there are kind of new epic songs being made, and people like the newer versions.
That's right. And this makes us think again of the social poetic framework where poets, rhapsodes, are composing in competition with other rhapsodes. And so you want to really advertise the newness of what you've got. Nobody's going to get up and say, oh, here's another take on the same old stuff using the same old words and the same old plot twists. No, what you've got is the newest take, even though it's an old story.
Right. So Telemachus is visited by Athena in disguise, who encourages him to go look for news of his father. And he goes to King Nestor of Pylos and then King Menelaus in Sparta. And in Sparta, he meets Helen of Troy, who's back now with Menelaus. And in the Iliad, we don't get the story of the Trojan Horse. That's something that a lot of readers are disappointed to, they finished the Iliad and there was no Trojan Horse. But the story is told in a flashback in the Odyssey at this scene where Menelaus tells the tale to Telemachus and Helen. So is there a reason why we get this story in the Odyssey? Or what is the function of this flashback that is inserted in this banquet?
I think there are probably multiple functions, and it's the first time in the poem, but it's not the last time that the Trojan Horse will come up. The first time in Book 4 that you mentioned, notice that it's part of a competition in storytelling. And I was just talking about a competition in composing things like the Odyssey. You see that in Nuclear, with Menelaus telling a story after Helen tells a story. Helen tells a story of how Odysseus was great in disguise. He penetrated Troy. He met her. She promised not to give him away. Everybody else was sad that he killed a bunch of Trojans, but she wasn't sad. So it's a great way of rewriting her personal history. Then Menelaus is the one who comes up with the story about Odysseus and others in the Trojan Horse. And the story, the point of it in that kind of competitive tale-telling is that Helen went around kind of feeling the horse and imitating the voices of the wives of all the heroes. So it was very witchy kind of ventriloquism. And it seems to be undercutting Helen's most recent claims to have been always on the Greek side, even while she was, undergoing her Stockholm syndrome in Troy.
Interesting. So in Book 5, we finally find Odysseus on the island of Ogygia. He's with the goddess Calypso, and supposedly she wants to marry him and make him immortal. But he is sitting on the beach looking across the sea and weeping for his return home. And although it is the gods that send Hermes to tell Calypso, let him go home finally, some have seen this as the moment where Odysseus lets go of the desire for immortality. Is that an interpretation that you find plausible?
Yeah, very much so. I think that's the great refusal. He refuses to try to be a god. Now, there are good reasons for that, which are very subtly alluded to even in Book 5 of the poem. What happens if you're a mortal and you end up with a divine goddess as your consort? You're in danger. And the beginning of Book 5 opens with a reference to the story of Tithonus, who was the consort of the goddess of the dawn. And we all remember how that did not end well. Most of the Homeric books that talk about sunrise just say sunrise happened or the goddess Eos got out of bed. But this one is the only book, Book 5, that says she arose from her bed beside glorious Tithonus in order to bring light to mortals and to immortals. So the audience is put in mind of the Tithonus story. And you remember that's the one where the goddess Dawn loved the mortal Tithonus and begged Zeus that he be immortal. And Zeus said, okay. But she, the goddess, forgot to ask for immortal youth. And therefore, eventually he shrivels up to the size of a cicada, and she keeps him in a little cage and goes and has affairs with other people. The audience hears this, and then we hear about Odysseus refusing Calypso, and I think we know, but he also knows. It's like he has heard the myths. He knows what can happen to you if you hook up with an immortal goddess.
So the fate of Tithonus acts as a kind of foil for Odysseus, who I guess makes the right choice not to desire to be a god and to actually go home and enjoy old age with his family.
Precisely. On the other hand, he has made a choice by even going to Troy. And remember, at first he didn't want to do that. He tried to get out of it, according to the stories in other poems. He made the choice to get immortal fame. And look, it's chilling that he did. Here we are talking about this character or person in California 2,500 years later. So it worked.
He achieved a different kind of immortality.
Exactly.
So after Hermes bids Calypso let Odysseus go, he builds a raft and he makes his way across the sea for many days. And Poseidon comes back from the Ethiopians and says, "What? I don't like that guy," sends a storm. Odysseus almost dies, but he makes his way finally to the land of the Phaeacians. And there, that's book 6, we get the scene that is always included on any college course on the Odyssey, where Odysseus wakes up hearing cries. And there are these girls from the palace nearby who are washing clothes and playing with a ball. And the leader of the girls is the Princess Nausicaa. And she's always been considered a very compelling character. So could you tell us a bit about this scene, about Nausicaa, and why is this scene been such a classic in the whole epic?
Well, here, if we're filming that scene, I'm thinking Bogart and Bacall, because it has that kind of frisson. Basically, given lots of folktales, in that situation, the visitor guy, sailor to the island is going to end up with the young, innocent princess. That's the way it works. So I suspect the audience is primed for them somehow getting together. And in fact, this is played with later in the Phaeacian episode, when the Phaeacians say, "Hey, wouldn't it be great if this guy married Nausicaa?" But it doesn't happen that way. So it's kind of erotically tinged, playful. It's almost operatic to have the two of them choreographed in this way. And the naked Odysseus, holding a branch in front of him, comes out and basically woos her with this long speech about, "Gee, are you a goddess or a woman? If you're a goddess, you must be like Artemis. But if you're a woman, well, very happy is the man who's going to marry you." So it's just playful, and it's complete Mozart.
So when he comes out of the bushes, he's probably looking like the worst he's ever looked in his life, right? I mean, he's naked and covered in branches and twigs, and he's dirty and full of brine, and he's exhausted. His hands are bloody from grabbing on the rocks, when he's getting out of the sea. You can't think of a worse presentation, and yet he knows that he has to get this girl to help him if he wants to survive. And so, as you said, he flatters her, he doesn't approach, he doesn't want to scare her. And all of the other girls that were with Nausicaa, they run away, but she is courageous enough to stand there and face this strange man, and the power of his words is convincing to her. And then she ends up helping him.
And I think it goes two ways. It's certainly an illustration of Odysseus the rhetorician. But as you say, she also is kind of self-selected to be exactly the kind of person that would get together with Odysseus. She's courageous. She's aware of her status. She's still discreet. She's in command. And so, we're almost rooting for them to be a couple.
So thanks to her, she explains to him how he can get to the palace and what to do in order to win favor from her parents, the king and queen. And he gets there, and one thing that's always fascinated me with this the hospitality in the world of the epics is a guest comes and the guest is offered food and drink, and the hosts don't ask the identity of the person until they've eaten a lot and drunk a lot. I mean, they really let you dine and chat and have a good time before they even ask you who you are.
And, we are stuck with the representations in Homer unless we think comparatively and look at ethnographies. And when you look at ethnographies of, say, Central Asia or Afghanistan, this is, in fact, the usual thing. Now, you might ask, why is it that people let themselves be, to us, it looks like they're being taken advantage of? In a reciprocal system, first of all, if you do that to a guest friend, then when you are in a similar state, and remember, there are no Motel 6s, there are no restaurants, there's no guarantee that once you leave your village, anybody will take care of you. But if you have that reciprocal kind of chit to cash in, you will survive. And the second thing is the mythology about Zeus or other gods taking on human shape to actually test humans when it comes to hospitality. And if you flunk the test, then awful things happen to you. So, maybe the Phaeacians are thinking, oh, this could be a god. In fact, one of them says that. Did this guy come down from heaven? In a half-joking way. One of the anonymous onlookers as Odysseus is going to the city. So I think it's a complex thing, Homeric hospitality, but it probably is a real custom.
It's fascinating. So while Odysseus is being treated with Phaeacian hospitality, before he even tells the king and queen who he is, there is a bard who sings, I guess, epic poems. And Odysseus, he gives him a choice piece of meat, so, he gives him like a nice tip, and asks for the song of Troy. And yet, when he hears it, he weeps. He wants to hear this song, but he also is, in a way, saddened by it. So how do we explain this kind of poetic, poetic masochism or something? What's going on there?
Well, there are three separate songs. The first time around, the poet just kind of strikes up his song and sings about Odysseus and Achilles and how they once upon a time quarreled. And at that point, Odysseus also has to hide his tears with his cloak. And the Phaeacian king notices and sort of tries to distract people. Then they go out onto the athletic field, and there's a second song that Demodocus the bard sings about a kind of bawdy myth version. And then the third time around is when Odysseus gets to sort of select the tune. I don't know. I think this is also part of the setup. It's not that he can't control himself and he weeps on hearing of the fate of his comrades. He might very well know that he will weep, and that's the trigger to be recognized, because that's what happens after the third song.
So maybe this is the crafty Odysseus doing something that he knows will then make the king and queen really curious to know what his story is, and if he's connected to this heroic deeds of the...
Exactly. I mean, I think you can have it both ways. It's authentic tears, but the tears, as always with Odysseus, serve a purpose.
Right. Now, Demodocus is a blind bard in the story, and people have been fascinated with the possibility that this might be a kind of self-portrait that Homer is inserting, if indeed there was a Homer who was also blind. All this is speculative, but you've written on the self-consciousness of these epics, and do these bards, like Phemius back in Book 1, singing the new songs about Troy, and here Demodocus, the blind bard, does placing these bards within a story that is told by a bard, does that tell us something about the art of epic storytelling?
Yeah, I think it tells you that it's such a deeply rooted art that it's been able to achieve this meta level now and start kind of folding in on itself. It's not the only epic tradition that does that. The Hilali oral epic in Egypt often has episodes featuring bards, we'll call them. It is a way in which the audience reflects on the poet, and it's also, I think, a kind of advertising move, because frankly, the poets who were composing a 24-book Odyssey, which would have taken perhaps 3 days to perform altogether, are not the same as the poets Phemius and Demodocus within the poem. These guys do only maybe a couple of hours, maybe 300 line, the equivalent of half of a book of the Odyssey as we have it. So it's a kind of archaizing or retrojection, and at the same time an assertion like, yeah, we folks now had our roots back in that tradition where, check it out, they were fully employed court people getting protection and patronage. Probably poets in the 6th century who were competing in Athens at the Panathenaea did not have anything like that sort of patronage and privilege that a Demodocus and a Phemius had. So there's a certain wishful thinking there too.
This kind of meta-level episode, as you say, we also find it in Hamlet famously, where there's a play within a play, right?
And, if you think of play within play, structurally, the Odyssey is famous for having a poem within a poem or a poetic performance within the bigger poetic performance, and that's books 9 through 12, where Odysseus functions like a poet.
So the king and the queen, moved by Odysseus's tears, eventually ask him who he is, and then, as you say, he performs this epic poem within an epic poem, his travels with all these monsters and witches and gods and all these things. Now, that is the longest account Odysseus gives of who he is. But everywhere he goes, he meets people who ask him, who are you and where are you from? And in each case, he tells a story. And no two are alike. So who is the real Odysseus? Is there any way to know, or is he just this international man of mystery?
He's the man who makes you wonder who is Odysseus. I mean, that is, his identity is not to have a stable identity, which is, a real paradox for us. But it's the identity of a Hermes character. In some mythological genealogies, Hermes is actually a grandfather of Odysseus, as it turns out. But you're completely right. In his 5 major lies in the second part of the Odyssey, it's clear that they're all different stories. For the listeners on the inside, they get that performance that evening of Odysseus' identity, and he's as real to them as the story is. So again, it's the consciousness of this medium about its own ability to fictionalize.
It's fascinating. Your comparison with Hermes is interesting because Carl Jung, the famous psychoanalyst, he wrote about the archetypes in stories, and he classified Hermes as being the kind of trickster that you find in folklore traditions all around the world. And in a way, I guess, Odysseus is also a trickster. So is this an element of storytelling that is common to many different mythologies?
I think, as often with the Odyssey, there is a deep folktale template, but the interesting thing is that the poem always plays with the template and sometimes contradicts it or goes beyond it. So the template of the trickster is, you're right, completely Odysseus. Interesting thing about a lot of tricksters is that they are culture heroes, like Coyote in Native American tales, or Maui in Hawaiian mythology, who actually fishes up the Hawaiian Islands and kind of invents a lot of cultural products. So we might be looking for Odysseus to do that, but what does he really invent? Well, the thing that destroys a civilization, the Trojan Horse. He kind of challenges Athena, who's the other inventive, goddess of engineering. And so there are these curlicues and twists and plays on the basic trickster template as well.
Interesting. To go back really quick to the first line of the poem, Odysseus is called polutropos, and that is a word that is translated in a million different ways. So what's your take on that word? How do you translate it?
It perfectly captures him, because it is polytropic, the semantics of the word itself. So essentially it means having many turns, but the turns can be cognitive or they can be physical. So he turns around a lot, going in all different directions on the Aegean. But he also has many different twists and turns mentally or rhetorically.
Right. Now, his adventures include all kinds of monsters and formidable characters that have been used metaphorically to describe, things in our lives. For example, Scylla and Charybdis. You have 2 very bad choices, and people have used this metaphor or simile for thousands of years, saying, oh, well, that is a Scylla and Charybdis situation. So do these adventures and monsters have a kind of psychological interpretation, or is there something about these adventures that captures the big problems in life?
That's, a complicated kind of question, only because if you think of parallels, it's like Moby Dick and the whale. At some level, the whale is a whale, right? But if you're not encountering the white whale personally, and you're hearing about it, I think we tend to compensate by thinking of all the other possible meanings. If we're head-to-head with the white whale, we don't think of the possible meanings of the white whale. But it's only in the tradition, the reception of the story, that we begin to evolve this kind of chrysalis of interpretation. And so, yes, psychologically, socially. The interesting thing is that already in the 6th century BC, people were trying to interpret the Homeric poems allegorically. And so Scylla and Charybdis, Cyclops, I don't remember the Lystrygonians, but definitely sirens, all began to take on moral, ethical, cosmological meanings.
When I was a freshman in high school and we had to read the Odyssey, we had an assignment called Monsters of the Mind, where we had to give psychological interpretations. And I remember the quote, right answer for the Cyclops was narrow-mindedness, because it's one eye looking ahead, and this is like, the refusal to see bifocally.
Wonderful. That's the sort of instruction one would have had probably in the 1st century AD in a school in Egypt where people were still reading the Odyssey. So the allegorical urge continues.
When you read the Odyssey in school, was there any scene in particular that stood out?
I think the underworld was the most intriguing.
Well, let's go to that scene. It's a fantastic one, often called by the Greek episode name the Nequia. Odysseus, instructed by Circe, goes to this faraway island or whatever where there's tons of fog, and he digs this trench and pours blood there, and all these ghosts appear who want to drink the blood, and he meets a series of characters. He meets his mother, who has died since he's left for Troy. He meets Achilles, he meets Ajax, and here there are, there's so many things we can talk about here, but I guess what was the moment in this encounter with the dead that most impressed you?
It's hard to single out a particular one, but I'm going to say two. One where Ajax, who was the great enemy of Odysseus, chooses to just turn away from him. And that's like the ultimate hatred. You don't even talk to him anymore, even in the other world. Maybe we shouldn't say underworld, because as you point out, he doesn't actually go under or down anywhere. He goes to the very edge of the known world. But even there, hatred continues. And then the other thing is an episode within the Nequia, and that is the Catalogue of Women, when Odysseus recounts having seen all of these famous women of the past, wives of heroes, mothers of heroes, each one of whom tells her story to Odysseus. So he's the audience within the poem, and those are fascinating little bits, but the way in which he manipulates the retelling is also fascinating. You remember when they ask him to narrate, he starts telling about everything from the Cyclops on down. He tells about Circe, he tells about the underworld, he tells about seeing all of the famous women in the underworld, and then he says, well, it's getting late, folks. It's time to go to bed. And at that moment, the Phaeacians are kind of panicked because they haven't heard about Ajax and Achilles and Agamemnon and all of the great men of Troy. They've heard this kind of chick flick of all of the great women of the past. And they say to him, gee, it's not that late. Let's all get a whip round together and give him some more tripods and other stuff. And when they do that, Odysseus continues the story with all of the juicy parts about Achilles, Agamemnon, Ajax, and the rest. It's been shown that certain performers in oral epics in the 19th and 20th century have the same trick. Just when they get to the part they know the audience wants to hear, they pretend it's time to leave, and then the audience counters by lining up cigarettes or raki or whatever they have in order to encourage the performer to continue.
So Odysseus is a match in storytelling to the bards like Demodocus and Phemius.
Even better, because they're dependent on this patronage, but he can go around the world and convince people to pay him for his stories.
Right. So the Phaeacians help him get home. They send him on a ship, and he comes finally to Ithaca, his homeland. But the character he first interacts with and seeks the help of is the swineherd. And we get these remarkable glimpses into the everyday life in the country. So what do you make of that very rustic picture we get?
Yeah, it is interesting that it's not like heroic epic as we imagine it. And it's actually hard to think of real parallels, although in Gilgamesh you do have a character who is like the man of the forest, Enkidu. I think within the Odyssey, it's like the beginning of the pastoral tradition. And you see it even in the Cyclops episode, where you have a very careful depiction of what it's like to be out there with your pigs or your sheep or your goats. Probably the bards are playing to a broader audience and incorporating that part of the audience, kind of like the groundlings in Shakespeare, who would know about these things. And most likely, by the time the Homeric poems are composed, there are no more kings. your audience is going to be much more like Eumaeus, the pig herder.
Interesting. So Odysseus goes to his home and he's disguised as a beggar, and all the suitors are there consuming his property and they abuse him. And he finally vanquishes them through the famous test of the bow. There's this Odysseus's bow, which no man is strong enough to pull except for him. And the suitors are convinced that if they can just, wield this bow, they will gain the hand of Penelope in marriage. But of course, only Odysseus can actually pull the bow. So he pulls it, and then he and the swineherd and Telemachus slaughter all the suitors. Now, just real quick, this thing about the bow, where only the hero can wield it, that seems to be a kind of universal trope in mythologies everywhere, right? It's like the lightsaber that only the Jedi can use. It's useless for a stormtrooper, right? I mean,
it's a folktale thing too. I mean, if you look at Vladimir Prop's Morphology of the Folktale, one of the things is the magic weapon. But again, I think the Odyssey plays with the template trope. In fact, Telemachus, it seems, could also draw the bow. And he's just about to do so when Odysseus signals him. And of course, it would be a very weird Oedipal moment, because if Telemachus is the one who can draw the bow, then he wins Penelope. And we're back to a different kind of myth. All of the attention paid to the bow, with Penelope taking it out of the storeroom, the memory of the bow, all of that is a kind of poetic working up of, what I think is basically a kind of magic weapon motif.
And finally, Odysseus and Penelope are reunited. And Penelope sees this beggar and doesn't know what to think, because she, it's been so long. And they test each other. And it's this remarkable moment where Penelope seems to be Odysseus' equal in wits. Each of them has their way of testing the other, and they seem to be a match in mental fortitude, let's say.
I think it's the meeting of true minds. And, we want Penelope to be as good as he is. And now we can really see how she survived for 20 years, holding off the suitors and the rest of it, because she is just as polytropos, if not more, than he is. And she's the only one who can get under his skin and rile him up with this fake story about, let's move your bed out here. And he knows that the bed is built into a huge ancient olive tree, so it could not be moved unless some weird stuff has been going on. He just loses his cool at that point. But then she knows the depth of his emotional commitment. Of course, some people have argued that she knows his identity, even some books before this in book 19. And that's a long, ongoing debate.
Right. Now, unlike the Iliad, in the Odyssey, we have so many compelling female characters. We have Circe, we have Nausicaa, we have Penelope, we have Helen at the banquet mentioned earlier. So what do you make of this group of fascinating female characters in this epic?
Well, Samuel Butler's response. This is a 19th century novelist who wrote a book called The Authoress of the Odyssey, saying that the Odyssey was composed by a woman kind of like Nausicaa. It's not impossible that this poem was designed for audiences like the one we see in book 9 through 12 in Phaeacia, where there are men and women and princesses and powerful women like Arete waiting to hear things like the catalog of women. Even the existence of that in the poem tells you, this poem could have been composed either exclusively for women or largely for a male and female audience, perhaps by a woman. We won't know that.
That's so interesting. So is this reunion at the end, is that a happy ending?
Well, it's not the very end of the poem, as you know. So I think it's a happy ending as far as human endings go, because, look, 20 years have passed and it's like nothing has changed. So you get back, you tell your wife about all these great adventures, and then you tell her, by the way, I have to leave on another adventure pretty soon, because that's what Tiresias told me. But there's kind of no problem. She doesn't raise any objection to that. So that's a kind of fantasy happy ending. Of course, it's not the very end. That's book 23, and then book 24 of the poem comes when only the gods can put a real end to things. Otherwise, you have an endless vendetta. And that's what we find hard to deal with. We want the romantic ending. Now they're in bed, curtain falls, music rises, but there's another whole book to clean up the mess that Odysseus has caused by killing all of the flower of youth of the islands.
Right. And to go back to The Lord of the Rings, which you also mentioned that you liked at the same time you first read the Odyssey, there's a similar kind of unresolved aspect to the ending where Frodo will always have this wound from, his struggle with the the dark side, and Odysseus also has this burden, and there's an aspect of the story that remains unresolved. We are left with this feeling of wonder at what would come next.
And I think that is so useful on two levels. Number one, that's much more like life, where things are not wrapped up. There's always going to be a sequel. And number two, think of it from the purely poetic social economy. The poet's never going to go out of business because he's planted the seeds of another whole epic right there.
Richard Martin, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next time, we're going to have a philosophical dialogue about philosophical dialogues. It's going to be more meta than Odysseus's epic within an epic. In the meantime, if you would like to revisit the Odyssey, we've put up a list of recommended translations on the website at greasepodcast.com/15. There, you will also find some books by Richard Martin on epic and Greek mythology, which I highly recommend. If you enjoyed this podcast and think that others might like it too, then please tell your friends about the show, either the old-fashioned way or by sharing it on social media. If there's any topic you'd like us to cover in the future, or if you want to give us feedback, shoot us an email at greasepodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening to Ancient Greece, Declassified.
Can you still sing Orpheus? Then sing something that's going to last. 1,000 years slips by so fast, goes off into a dusty myth with you.